On this week's episode of Scaffolds, I talk about apple maggot, which should be showing up sooner than later. Carrick gives us insight on continued disease management, and Anna gives us our state of the state update on degree day accumulation and trap captures. This week, I have a relatively quick update. So first, I wanted to talk about the 2024 Virtual Orchard Meetup Series. The first one is going to be held on Thursday, June 6th at 7 p.m. Eastern. The topic for this first meeting is going to be water wisdom, navigating tree fruit production through drought and deluge. This is a joint effort between Michigan State University, the Cornell Cooperative Extension Lake Ontario Fruit Team, and Washington State University. Pre-registration is not required to attend, and I'm going to include the Zoom link in the show notes. So we're heading into the part of the season where we need to start thinking about apple maggot flies. And I think that I have a bit of a longer, maybe not time-wise long, but a long bit of information to share with you specifically about apple maggot. So I think we're expecting the first appearance of apple maggot flies in wild apple trees and abandoned orchards in eastern New York shortly. I think that in western New York, we'll see them a little bit later, but this all depends on temperatures and rainfall over the next week or two. So the ideal way for crop outs and consultants and growers, if they're interested in doing this on their own, is to use traps to monitor for these apple maggot populations. This approach is not always recommended in some cases. So some orchards, if they have really high populations which require regular sprays, then what's the point of trapping, right? Some orchards have really low populations, rarely needing sprays. So as with most pest issues, it's going to be important to understand the nature of your farm. And lastly, most commercial New York orchards have moderate or variable pressure, which can make this monitoring critical for timing sprays. So in order to detect apple maggot, yellow sticky cards have been used for over 50 years. These panels are helpful in detecting the presence overall of apple maggot flies. And what we expect is that the flies should be emerging from hibernation from the soil anytime in mid-June to early July in New York. Again, this really depends on soil temperature and overall weather, but I think we're overall a bit pushed up this season, so it's time to start thinking about it now. And during the first 7 to 10 days of their adult life, they feed on aphid honeydew and then become sexually mature. And after they're sexually mature, they are attracted to those yellow sticky panels, and they see them as sort of these super leaves during the early stage. A few panels in an orchard can serve as an early warning device if there's a likely apple maggot emergence site nearby. So again, those wild apples or abandoned orchards. Many flies spend time outside the orchard before searching for fruit to mate and lay eggs, making these advanced warning traps somewhat difficult to use for their exact purpose. But a single catch of a sexually mature fly means an immediate spray is needed, and you could pose a major risk to your crop if you aren't checking those traps daily in that case. There are also some other trap options which could be arguably more effective. So there is this red apple looking or red sphere trap. It's shaped like a quote-unquote super apple. And this helps to catch flies early and allowing for twice weekly checks. There's a 1 to 2 day response time before spraying with those traps. Research shows that these traps can use a higher threshold than the traditional yellow panels, with 5 flies per trap as the new threshold for spraying. So it's recommended to hang 3 volatile baited spear traps in a 10 to 15 acre orchard on the outside row facing any probable apple maggot migration direction. So example would be if you have an orchard that's backed up to a woodlot where you know there are wild apples, or an abandoned orchard, this might be the way to deploy those traps. So the point of hanging traps is to check them. I know it sucks. It's not fun. It's feels like a frivolous activity, but if you make the effort to put them out, checking them periodically, and spraying when the average catch per trap is at 5 or more apple maggots captured. And I think for this, another key thing is that the proper identification of apple maggot is critical, and there's tons of resources for this online. If you have a home apple planting, you can try trapping out local apple maggot populations with these red sphere traps, and this can moderately protect fruit. It's not going to guarantee that you will not have apple maggot damage. So one of these sphere traps is recommended per 100 to 150 apples. There are a bunch of different types of traps and lures available. So permanent sphere traps, which are wood or stiff plastic, disposable sphere traps, which are a flexible plastic, are just 2 examples. So the disposable traps last 1 season and are cheaper, and there are other traps that you use from year to year that can be more difficult to clean and more time consuming. and you can get apple volatile lures for use with any trap. So I think that's the next pest on our radar to be thinking about. Next week, I'll be joined by Anna Wunsch to talk about viruses in apple trees. So looking forward to that discussion next week. See you then.
All right, welcome to another edition of Scaffold's Plant Pathology. What are we going to talk about this week is going to be fire blight, and I'm going to bring in powdery mildew because we're going to start moving into the summer diseases. I'm going to talk also a little bit next week about apple blotch, formerly known as Barcelona blotch or blight. All right, fire blight. What's it look like this week? We had a cold week, and I'd started to see shoot blight in my own blocks and a little bit of blossom blight finally in the inoculated checks. And a few strikes were here and there, but it's been really cold. Now we're going to get an early spike of hot weather at the beginning of the week, but then it's going to break with a bunch of thunderstorms. That being said, if you need to prune out fire blight today before the rain is great. And if before the heat tomorrow morning would also be a good time to do it. You want cool, dry weather. And we've had some pretty decent dry weather. And there might be a little bit of a storm coming through Western New York and this region. But as you're moving in maybe to the east, you're probably still good to continue cutting out fire blight. If it does rain tonight, give it a little bit of time in the morning to clear out. You don't want to be pruning in the dew. And you don't want to be pruning when it's probably above 75 or 80. So if you can, find a cool, dry evening, I would say early evening, mid-afternoon, if you can get it, if we have a couple extra days this week. I don't think it's going to be a bad fire blight season. So as we can see in the recommends, remove as soon as a cool, dry day is coming up. I think there might be some options towards the end of the week, right before those thunderstorms, or just right after them if they come in a flash and you have a day or two after. You can cut this fire blight out. The old recommended best management practice is to go into multiple years of wood. Second year is best, but if you can get even further away from this blighted strike that you might see and into other tissue from older wood, you're going to minimize the chance of that fire blight moving. It can ride the water slide all the way to the main leader and out to the roots and back to your fruit, but if it has a hard time making those yearly growth, junctions, if you will. It has a harder time getting through that tissue. It can move through the succulent tissue pretty quickly, but it's a little slower on those. So the older and the more many years of wood it has to pass, the slower it's going to migrate. And as cut into healthy years tissue. Now, if you're in a young tree and you're like, oh, the healthy 12 inches is already in the main scaffolds, you're probably better off removing the entire tree and replanting. It's going to be a nightmare to retrain. I had this happen to a couple of my young plantings, and as soon as the grant is done, they just look like awful. They look like little silly bushes that you might find at a big box store. They just need to be removed as soon as the grant can be done, because there's no amount of training that I was able to do to kind of whip them back into shape. You get that young tree and you're near the scaffolds, you're finished. And you can do the rescue program if you need to. In this case, what you'll want to do is sort of apply it before you prune it. Wait 5 days if you can. Hopefully the peroxidone calcium is slowing it down. Doesn't seem to be slowing down. You probably have to prune and then prune again every 2 weeks. If your pruning restimulates, you'll have to make some more cuts as well. All right, so powdery mildew. We're moving into powdery mildew season. I've already been out in a lot of my orchards and have seen primary infected shoots and blossom clusters. Now, the blossom clusters happen a little bit earlier on in varieties such as Ida Red. I typically see those, but in my Goldens and my Jonah Golds and my Ginger Golds, right now is when you first start to see that young primary shoot growth from the second-year-old wood that fire blight hates migrating through, and this will sort of emerge and it'll be covered with white powdery mycelium and spores. It'll kind of look like you sprinkled powdered sugar or something on the leaves as well. And those are going to be your primaries. And that's from infections last season. Now, what these are going to do is they're going to spread spores in the wind-blown rain, and they don't need a lot of rain or free moisture to cause infection. They just need high humidity. And so if you have a lot of overcast days with thunderstorms, and it's hot in the interim, it can actually be the best type of weather for powdery mildew. So it doesn't need a lot of free moisture, doesn't need a little bit to get the job done, but it doesn't like to be sopping wet. And so if you have these days where thunderstorm comes and it dries and the humidity is just generally high, That's going to be the best weather for powdery mildew. And then that's when the secondary infections will start happening of the developing terminals as they continue to expand throughout the season. And you might see more focused lesions like these. This will happen with infections from the primary, take a couple of weeks until they sporulate again in that high relative humidity that comes with hot weather and sort of more storm type conditions. Now, sadly enough, these Canidia will try to infect fruit and tend to fail. But when they do fail, they will damage the fruit surface and lead to a net-like russeting. And if you're looking at a piece of fruit, you're like, well, the russeting doesn't follow the patterns of how a water drop might roll around the fruit, but it kind of looks spiderwebby. You might think, and you see powdery mildew, then you can think, well, you know what? That's probably a powdery mildew fruit infection. So again, it's going to be really big and problematic in warm, dry periods in the spring and summers. We're coming into these now where we have the storms and then we have the hot weather and then it's overcast leading to high humidity. And a lot of the other cultivars that don't get a lot of apple scab will be hit by the powdery mildews. I can see it on Honeycrisp. I really heavily on Ida Red and the Goldens, Golden Delicious, John of Gold, anything with golden parents like that. Cortland is another really big one that can get hit with a lot of powdery mildew. And it's a nice time. We think it's gotten so hot, I don't have to worry about apple scab. And yes, the rain periods aren't very long anymore. But if the mildew is entrenched, and it will be more entrenched when it's drier along the lake regions of New York, these things can just sort of spiral out of control, moving into a harvest if you're not doing a lot of good mildewcides in the summer. And so you might ask, well, what about fungicide resistance? It's not been a problem. We had a study that my former student did looking at places all over New York. And while the materials seem less effective in general, there's no evidence of any molecular fungicide resistance looking at sites all throughout New York and all the major production regions. So you might say, well, what are the best things I use? I have to use them now. Only if you have varieties and a history of problem with powdery mildew in this hot but alternatingly over dry weather with a little bit of rainstorms. If you have these conditions, you're seeing mildew, you're seeing the primary shoots out in the orchards, you might think, yep, I should probably stay a little vigilant, a little longer to about third or fourth cover and take this out. Now, being vigilant is only also going to help you against the apple blights that I'll talk about next week as well. So the best materials, historically, the DMIs are the best group. They're a little less effective than they were in the 1990s, but they're still very strong. In general, you might not know unless you're spraying them all in different parts of your orchard and comparing them. Well, why would you do that? That's what my job is to do, spray them in different parts of my orchard and compare them so I can tell you things like this. Second best group is the QOIs. Less effective as well. No evidence of qualitative resistance. This is a fungicide that you can develop single gene resistance, complete shutdown fairly quickly. But all the evidence that we found from surveying the sites and orchards in New York suggests this hasn't happened yet. I usually call this falls into my best fungicide group. So things with DMIs and QOIs are going to be some of the better products. SDHI fungicide group is a different one. It targets a different part of the mitochondria than the QOIs. I don't think they're as strong as powdery mildew. They are really good when they're paired with one of the QOI fungicides. There's a couple of premixes, the Luna Sensation, the Maravon, and these products, when they use a little bit of both, seem to do a little bit better than either one on their own. The other thing you can do is frequent sulfur applications. And then, as I've noticed, we're not really barreling into a hot summer. I think this is more feasible in this particular instance. You could go ahead with a little bit of sulfur. You really get that sulfur injury when the temperatures get above 85 degrees for a little while. So this is sort of your epidemiology of the powdery mildew, how this silly thing happens. For the most part, these are the primary shoots that are infected last year. You're not really finding a lot of chasmathesia. This is a more robust overwintering structure that might be present in more of the southern states. It's just going to overwinter as mycelium inside buds. And this is completely a result of what happened last year. These things are going to burst out, and you're like, well, should I do something at green tip if there's a bunch of powdery mildew in it? No, don't really worry about it. Your apple scab sprays are going to be handling that component. And if you see this, you think, well, I guess those apple scab sprays didn't work. If those buds break and make a terminal of sort of white, powdery mycelium around the edge and a lot of spores, or if you happen to have the flower cluster that's doing it, depending on your variety, and you think, well, yeah, that didn't work. And I don't think that's your best thing, opportunity. You can do some things, moving it down a little bit. And I think what you're doing, if you're doing things for apple scab, sanitation and pruning are just, I've shown them as potential options and how these things might shift the curve a little bit in silver tip copper. And these work better for apple scab than they do for powdery mildew. But if you're already doing sanitation and a bunch of things for apple scab, great. You're just already going to get the benefits. And I really sort of get a question mark on how valuable that is in general. And then, of course, from that point on, once these things are out, they're going to just be infecting the newly expanding terminal leaves. And then Canidia will come and try to fail at the ability for, and then fruit infection just doesn't really happen in that particular instance, but it can make a nasty russeted fruit. So you really want to target managing around here. And what these are going to do, are they going to sort of take the curve of the mildew, powdery mildew incidence. And this is going to be where you get your best bang for your buck. We don't recommend a lot of the sanitation practices that I talked about there. I don't think they're going to be as strong. If you're doing them, great. Don't do extra stuff. And besides, all that stuff at green tip, silver tip, and copper, that's long past at this point. And that's why we're going to really focus on this stuff. I like to put a kind of a big slash on really focusing here. And we're finding out that the best way to beat mildew is to stop these secondary cycles. And this is your exponential part of the epidemic, incidence going up over time. And these fungicides are going to squash it. So every lesion you kill at this stage, or lesions here, is going to take that exponential rise in disease and flatten it down. And we're really thinking of materials that are good antisporulants, like a lot of the QOIs. The DMIs are fantastic as well, because they're going to be shutting down mildew growth as it tries to get into the leaf and colonize and set this mat up that will then sporulate. And so if you can really go with antisporulent fungicides, and you can start from bloom to second cover, combination of the two will sort of push that exponential curve down to a point by the time you finally get to harvest, the big green line, the finish line, if you will, you'll be good to go. And with that, I think that covers most of what I want to say for powdery mildew. Let's see, what do we have next? Yep, it's really where you're going to focus on it. And we're going to rehash these fungicides just one more time. You can go protectant sulfur only. It's important to note that the Cap 10 mancozeb during all of these phases aren't very important. If I want to show different performance, I'll use this as a sort of a negative control. This will allow a lot of mildew to take place, but not a lot of apple scab, this Cap 10 plus mancozeb. And so it's a great way to evaluate powdery mildew fungicide treatments. The best ones, again, 7 to 10 days bloom, second or third cover, particularly if we have this sort of extended dry but bursts of wet weather, are the best ones there. The DMIs, the QOIs are number one, SDI is second. And if you do use a QOI SDHI premix, pretty good. Their models are helpful, but in general, they're not very specific for powdery mildew. We have developed a couple, evaluated a couple here that could be useful, but until apple scab goes away permanently, you're going to want to focus on timing your applications for apple scab. And then, more importantly, if you have to go out and spray for fire blight, might as well manage your fungal disease then as well. So I don't think we're quite at a point where we need to use apple powdery mildew models yet, but they're there. And I had a student, David Strickland, who had evaluated them all, and we do have the best ones should the time come. Or if you only have powdery mildew sensitive varieties and you have a bunch of resistant apple scab varieties, they might be a little bit useful there, but I don't think we need it yet, and they're not in NEWA. So in terms of the overall management, a lot of these things can be doing good. Anything that is no longer useful to your operation, winter pruning, summer pruning, is just going to remove any infected bud tissues. Copper, it may not actually impact the mildew that much, but it's not bad, and it will help your apple scab and fire blight. And if you're really leaning into the protectants, you go sulfur, probably starting at type cluster and keeping a low rate. I think we did recommend maybe 7 pounds to the acre of microthiol. I like that product because it mixes very well and doesn't leave a lot of sludge in your tank. There are other products as well. If there was a liquid sulfur, it would probably be my top pick moving into there. And if you are going out with the single site fungicides, 11 and 3 seem to be your best ones. You can start as early as pink, but I really recommend more of the, bloom, the second cover, maybe third cover as well. And at this point, you're really managing those secondary infections that cause a lot of trouble. All right. With that, we'll see you again next week and we'll talk some about apple blotch.
And now for the state of the state, your weekly roundup of phenology and degree day accumulations from the major fruit production regions of the state. As usual, I'm Anna Wallace from the New York State IPM program at Cornell, and I'll be sharing information aggregated from the regional specialists across the state. Now that we're moving into June, let's have a quick look back at the spring and the month of April. It's been a record warm spring. All 3 months, March, April, and May, have been warmer and wetter than average. Pretty soggy in some places. Over the month of May, 2 to 3 inches were recorded at most NEWA weather stations, and in April, 3 to 4 inches were recorded. Last week was somewhat warm, but not quite as hot as the previous week. High temperatures earlier in the week were only up in the upper 60s in many places, and then in the upper 70s by the end of the week. Relative humidity was very high across most of the state in most of the week. Precipitation that was recorded at most NEWA weather stations ranged from 1/4 of an inch to a full inch, mostly recorded earlier in the week, Monday and Tuesday, with some sites, mostly in the Hudson Valley and some lake sites, recording precipitation on Thursday last week. In the forecast, both the 6 to 10 day and 8 to 14 day outlooks on the NOAA Climate Prediction Center are predicting normal to slightly cooler than average temperatures and wetter than average conditions. Rain is expected for most of the rest of the week in most places throughout the state for the latter part of this week. And that's probably good timing. We haven't had much rain for the past few days. Phenology across the state now. We continue to be well ahead of degree day averages across the state, mostly owing to that really warm period a couple of weeks ago in the early spring. With the warm weather and the wet conditions, we've seen a huge increase in activity in both phenology and in pest complexes. We're concluding the thinning window in most places in the state, wrapping it up maybe in the northern part of the state. And so most people are wrapping up their thinning sprays and beginning to think about return bloom sprays. In the Hudson Valley, apples are between 20 to 30 millimeters, depending on variety, location, and the amount of thinning that's been done. Cherries are starting to color. Peaches and nectarines are also sizing nicely. In western New York, the Lake Ontario region, Geneva, and similarly in the Capital region, fruit is pretty similar, maybe slightly smaller. Fruit is ranging from 20 to 25 millimeters at the end of the thinning window. In the Champlain Valley, we're approaching 20 millimeters in many places and varieties, also near the end of the thinning window. Looking at some upcoming pest events, we have a long list to report today. Starting with plum curculio, we've seen a lot of activity in unmanaged or lower managed areas. The insects tend to move into the orchard starting at petal fall, as we've reported in the past couple of weeks of the podcast. At this point in most of the state, we have reached the end of that window and they're moving into the orchard. That's typically around 308 degree days base 50 after petal fall. And so at this point, most of those insects have moved into the orchard, and cover sprays should have been able to manage them. Looking at some of the lepidopterans, both OFM and codling moth flights are ending in many places. And so now is a good time this week, early in this week, or at the end of last week, sort of the window opened for insecticide applications targeting larvae. In northern locations, that might be toward the end of this week. That's typically around 200 to 250 degree days base 50 after the biofix. Oblique-banded leaf roller trap captures have been recorded in a few different places. It's our second week in a row in a couple of Hudson Valley sites, and so we know these insects are beginning to be active. But it's a little bit too early to be applying any insecticides targeting summer larvae yet. We're seeing more and more aphid activity, both green apple aphids and rosy apple aphids, as well as woolly apple aphids. Remembering that the green apple aphids will typically be on the shoot tips and kind of curling the leaves backwards. Rosy apple aphids tend to curl the leaves quite a bit more and sometimes can turn them pink, so they can be pretty easy to spot. Woolly apple aphid we're still seeing mostly on old pruning cuts, usually 2 or older year pruning cuts, typically around the vascular ring that you see on that cut. Typically we're finding them with wool, This week, we're getting the first reports of woolly apple aphid moving out into those leaf axils, so be looking for that. We've been seeing a little bit of tarnished plant bug injury, just a small amount of fading this year. They're usually more of a problem when it's a dry season, so the insect will be looking for some kind of water source, and that injury, again, looks like sort of dimples in the fruit. We've been seeing and having reports of leaf hopper damage and sawfly damage. Leaf hopper damage is going to look like curling back of the newest leaf tissue and sometimes yellowing along the edge. At this point in time, sawfly damage looks similar to LEP internal fruit damage, with boring into the fruit and then frass coming out of those holes. So you can be looking for that damage. San Jose scale crawlers are expected to be active around this time too. So if you're monitoring for those crawlers using double-sided tape around the trunk or a limb near an active infestation, you can be checking those traps now for crawlers. Now is a good time to begin sampling for European red mites. Beginning in June, we use a threshold of 2.5 mites per leaf, and we use sequentialing sampling to determine whether any action is needed for management. So you would start by sampling 20 leaves, 4 each from 5 trees, and inspecting each of them to see if there's presence or absence of mites. And so you'd use 2.5 mites per leaf as present, and anything less would be absent. Next, you could use the mite sampling chart in the Cornell guidelines to determine if you have enough leaves with presence to warrant action, or if you should continue sampling. Apple leaf curling midge is a pest that's becoming more and more of a problem in some locations throughout the state. We've been seeing it for a couple of weeks now. It tends to curl the leaves back pretty aggressively, and then they get a little bit brittle. So you can uncurl those leaves to see the nymphs, which turn bright orange before they pupate and fall to the ground. Moving into diseases, we are getting the first reports and observations of fire blight strikes in eastern New York and a couple of places in the Hudson Valley and in the Capital Region. You can be sending samples to Kara Cox's lab for testing for streptomycin resistance, and we encourage you to do that. Primary scab season is finished for the season, but we are detecting abundant lesions in unmanaged places and in a couple of managed blocks, so be vigilant looking for those to make sure that you don't need to be on top of managing secondary scab. Especially with the cooler, humid weather, it can quite easily get out of hand, and more spores can be available for infection. We're continuing to see a lot of powdery mildew across the state. It's becoming more and more prevalent with the continued warm, humid weather, so be looking for that. Rust is also becoming more prevalent, so you can be looking for the bright orange sporulation on leaves. We're seeing frog eye leaf spot or black rot lesions on leaves now too, and we're beginning to see the very earliest sooty blotch and fly specks, so you can be inspecting your fruit for summer diseases and making sure to stay on top of your management for those summer diseases. Looking at cherries and berries, we're continuing to monitor for spotted-winged Drosophila across the state, and we have had our first trap captures across much of eastern New York from the Hudson Valley up into the Capital Region. The trap captures have been in really low numbers, between 2 and 5 or 8 insects per trap in both jar and sticky red cards. So we know that that insect is present, and most of these traps have been in fruit that is still unripe. Just a reminder that we are switching over to a new blog. This is the Berry Pest Monitoring Network, and we've sent a couple of different blog posts reminding people to switch over. We are continuing to cross-post first trap captures and other blog posts to both the new blog and the old spotted-winged Drosophila blog, but we encourage everyone to move over to the new blog so that you can be sure to be getting the most accurate information. We encourage both berry growers as well as cherry and grape growers to subscribe too if they're interested in getting updates about spotted-winged Drosophila. And as you're selecting your insecticides for managing this insect, we have posted the quick guide for insecticides on the Cornell Fruit Resources page, as well as the regional fruit team websites. So you can be using that quick guide to select insecticides and rotate insecticides to help manage resistance. And now here are the current degree days in major fruit-producing regions across the state. Throughout the season, we've been aligning this information with previous work done by Art and Yellow relating to Macintosh phenology and degree days base 43. In Geneva, we're currently at 1,046. Highland at the Hudson Valley Research Lab, 1,126. Clifton Park, 1,006. Peru, 840. Medina, an inland site, 1,022. Appleton North, a lake site, 895. Fairville, an inland site, 961. And Williamson, a lake site, 958. That's all for this week, and good luck until next time.